I'm delighted to introduce Craig Parkin and David Powell. Craig is the Chief Fire Officer for Nottinghamshire Fire and Rescue Service, and David is the co-founder of the East England Flood Group and currently working with the National Consortium for Societal Resilience. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
So we're going to kick off the session today. Whilst we frame this around Storm Henk, we're just going to put it in context and talk about flooding generally. So I had a look at the National Resilience Framework and I discovered that the word flood appears 26 times in it. It's a document that encourages a whole of society approach to resilience, and it talks about acute risks, not the chronic risks. So I imagine lots of people listening to us today are aware of the National Resilience Framework. But what I wanted to ask you both was, in terms of what it says about flooding, what does it have to say about the emergency services, what should be doing before, during and after floods? And what were your sort of thoughts about how it sets the context for you both in terms of your work? So David, perhaps if I could start with you.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Yeah, look, I think most people would welcome the focus the National Resilience Framework has placed on whole of society resilience. So really trying to say, look, everybody has a part to play here to be more resilient to all sorts of events, but of course, flooding for the context of today. I think over the last 10 years, we've recognised a changing narrative in the way that we approach community resilience. You know, it's not unusual that we used to say, look, we're here to save you. Over more recent years, though, I think it's become more and more and increasingly clear that most agencies can no longer promise to do that. We just don't have the same kind of resourcing, funding, and capabilities that we once had. So we have to change the narrative to have a conversation with communities about what they can do themselves to become more resilient. Businesses, voluntary community groups to prepare better themselves for some of the very obvious threats and risks that they face that they could be better prepared for. And I think COVID really was the kind of the end game to that, in that we really ought to celebrate that the communities and the UK population proved to be incredibly resilient, actually. You know, a lot of people did exactly what they were asked to do and adjusted their lives, adopted their life to the ongoing risks and did incredibly well. But it also, I think, really put a highlight on some of the fragilities and the vulnerabilities in society. And I think where this particular framework can become powerful is if we begin to really focus in on that kind of 20% of the population whom we can all help a little bit more to become stronger and more resilient to both acute and chronic threats. So absolutely recognise, the value of it. I think the next thing we need to do is work out how to do it. You know, how do you deliver that is the real challenge.
We'll come on to that. So brilliant. So resilience framework about 18 months ago now. So Craig, in terms of your role as Chief Fire Officer in Fire Rescue Service, how does the National Resilience Framework fit in with you and your work, particularly when it comes to your community risk management plans?
Yeah, thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. I guess really we're surrounded by statute and duties and responsibilities, and whatever flood response may not be a statutory duty, it's certainly something I've been doing in a 30-year fire service career. So whether it's a statutory duty or not, or fits within a framework, many reports and debriefs have said, well, our communities expect it of us. I think the framework, there's lots of summary actions in there, what will be done by which time and everything else. So is that going to actually be achieved? I think from our perspective, how does that fit with our risk management planning process? So the identification of risk, how does it help with that? And ultimately, how does it give reassurance and confidence to our communities? We are going to be there when we are there. Now, David's point is right. I operate within my means. My means are somewhat smaller than they were a number of years ago. I think that's true testament to, everybody would argue that. So we have to be very careful and proportionate about where we put our resources. I think the other side of that, nationally, the sector has got better through its national coordination framework. So it can call upon assets where we've got localised issues. So Storm Henk, for example, get localised issues in numerous areas, not just Nottinghamshire, but we could call upon a far more defined mutual assistance process. And I think the framework, resilience framework, is taken into consideration when we're deploying our resources, Catherine.
Yeah. And with that, would you be talking about something like the high volume pumps that came through the New Dimension programme? Is that the kind of assets you're talking about at national level?
Yeah, it's the kind of getting the act together in the sector through the National Coordination Advisory Framework. Not just the high volume pumps. They are useful, but not really when it's raining or you've still got a flood risk. Because where do you send the water to? If you think about the trends, if water's coming through on one side of the county, 24 hours later it's passing through the other side of the county going towards Lincolnshire. So high volume pumps can be useful, but I think it's about knowing who's at risk in the first place, being prepared with your partners. And David touched on it as well. How prepared are communities before the event? And then you're talking about warning and informing, because I think there are some things in the process that are useful.
Okay. That was published 18 months ago. And in January this year, we saw a report from the Public Accounts Committee, which talked about resilience to flooding and said that there were 5.7 million properties in England at risk of flooding, which I was quite shocked by. That's quite a very large number. It talked about the government having no overall measure of the resilience it expects to achieve and doesn't know if it's making progress towards its ambitions of a nation more resilient to flooding. So that's slightly concerning, isn't it? That if the resilience isn't there, it's just never going to get better. What are your thoughts on that?
For my point, Catherine, I think there's two issues at play here. One is I think increasingly the need to work out what the public value of being resilient is in pure pound, shillings and pence is becoming really critical, because you've got to balance out all the other responsibilities on people like the fire service, for indeed, because I'm sure Craig will share with us the full extent of all of the responsibilities that they have. So being able to argue with partners, with agencies, with organisations, look, there is an absolute public value of being more resilient. There is a value of you investing time and effort in doing this work is going to pay off longer term. But I come back to the point I made to you earlier on. I'm not surprised at this point of the report's finding, because I still think that we are still trying to work out exactly how to do it. A lot of people understand and support the ideal of societal resilience, but in truth, individual organisations can't do it alone. There are broader agendas here that have a role to play. It's a much wider systems-based approach that will need to make society more resilient. And I think we're still trying to work through how best to do that effectively, whilst also dealing with all the other responsibilities that go around. But at least we're taking a step in the right direction, I have to say, is a positive.
Yeah. So Craig, for you, the Fire Rescue Service, you're part of the Local Resilience Forum. Is that enough? That's the strength of that partnership. Is that still working? We're 20 years in. It's 20 years since the Civil Contingencies Act. Is it really solid and working well in terms of that partnership arrangements that David's talking about there?
Look, I think it depends on when the event happens and and how much have you been doing, how stable are your partners, and how strong are the relationships locally before the event. It's okay having a response side, but it's that preparedness element. And have you been exercising and training? Do you know your partners well? Do you know their phone numbers even? Who do you speak to? And making sure that everybody in that systems approach that David's touched on a couple of times, that they are trained, confident and competent to perform their role. Everybody coming to the table, understanding why they are there, and particularly at strategic coordinating groups, making sure that people around the table can actually speak for their agency. Because if all that there is a messenger, the wrong person's at the table, and the response to communities is lesser than it should have been.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. About certainly, I've heard that one before about having the phone number of the people that you need to contact when it's it is an emergency. Which brings me on nicely actually to the National Risk Register, so linked in with the National Risk Framework, Resilience Framework, and where flooding sits in amongst the 89 risks that are identified in that. And it's got a likelihood of 3 and an impact of 4, which suggests that's quite high and concerning. It also puts flooding into 3 different areas. It talks about fluvial, coastal and surface. And I was sort of wondering, in terms of those definitions, does it matter when you're having a flood? So when we come to talk about Storm Henk, do you respond differently depending on the type of flooding, or is all flooding equal? Perhaps Craig, if you could share us with how that works from a fire perspective.
Look, if you want to give reassurance to communities, they're not interested in what the definition is. They just want some help. And I think we kind of need to keep that in our minds. We can make it as technical and defined as we want. But if we keep it at its simplest base level, it's a crisis for somebody with waters coming through the door. If their property or business is affected, it's a pretty big crisis to them. I may not call it a crisis as chief fire officer. I may call it a fairly localised event, but for them, it's the worst day of the week. So I think it's useful to understand where these things are coming from. I think it's understand about the compounding effects as well. So if the rivers are doing something a bit strange and then it rains in terms of localised areas and they've got some particular issues of surface flooding, for example, or poor drainage or aging drainage systems, I think it's good to understand that local terminology. So I would imagine a lot of my firefighters at particular stations, if it rains in their area, know which streets are going to be flooded. They'll understand that now. So from a local risk and local knowledge perspective, it's really, really useful. I think ultimately I need to know the size of the problem and how much capability I'm going to need. And is that going to be my own capability in the service, as most of Henk was? Or is that something a bit more where, again, we've talked about the go big, go early day occasions, and I know I've repeated it. Do you need to get the things in place quickly?
Yeah. So the National Risk Register, David, is quite a difficult document to read in some ways, and with its little charts and everything. So from your perspective, is it useful to think about flooding and think where it is and likelihoods and impact in this way? Or is it just a kind of, that's a strategic thing and that's fine for the planners, but not on the ground? I mean, what are your thoughts from your perspective, particularly working with the NCSR as you are now?
Yeah, it's interesting on who the audience is, Catherine, of the public community risk registers. I just support a point that Craig had made, if I may. In our experience, communities don't care who's responsible for which kind of flooding. And at the moment, there is a split between responsibility for fluvial surface water between local authorities and the Environment Agency. And we've heard so many times from communities where agencies have gone in and said, well, that's not actually my responsibility. That's incredibly frustrating for a conversation with communities who you're asking to do something different in the way they live with that risk. I think the community risk register have a limited role because they tend to be used on a kind of spreadsheet, red, amber, green, ranked rating, schematic. Actually, that's of no use to a community if you're trying to explain what is the risk they're living with. So I do think we need to think a little bit more about how we present that information, but certainly looking at the East Coast flood. So we're talking, to be clear, about a 1953 style coastal surge, with significant impacts. And the nearest we came to that was probably back in 2013, where we'd have what I would describe as a near miss, which frankly, I think truly tested our capacity and our capability, over 73 severe flood warnings. And that was just for a near miss. So I think concentrating, for my point, on those kind of, low probability but high consequence events and being very clear that those events also normally come with a predictive forecast of at least 3-4 days to start getting ready is a really good start point for people like Craig and his partners to have a conversation about how agile, how flexible can we be in our thinking to get ahead of this stuff and get our assets deployed, as Craig was saying earlier on. And probably as important, removing people from danger, of course, where appropriate before a storm hits. Localized surface water flooding, it's debatable just how much you can really do to get ahead of that kind of event. So, our focus in the East Coast, certainly with the NCSR, has been more around predictable events where you can go and have a really sensible conversation with communities and businesses about how they could prepare.
Okay. All right. Well, should we take all of that thinking to Nottinghamshire, to January, to cast your mind back, Craig, and let's have a talk about Storm Henk. What does it look like? So you're sitting in the fire service and you know it's going to rain and you've heard all these predictions and we're presumably looking at what the Met Office is telling us. How do you prepare? Give us a sort of sense of what it's like in the fire service and the control room and when you're talking to the watches, what does that look like for those of us who've never been in the fire service?
Well, if we've got people who are sort of like firefighters on the call, what I'm about. I think for me, it's about that long-term view. So, I remember being a swift water rescue technician and being trained to do that 25 years ago. So what does it look like on the ground? It's kind of really hard work. So how do you prepare for that? The IRMP process, I suppose, brought a little bit of that in when it looked at, all fire and rescue related risk and doing that. And that includes, and of course, it says rescue on the side of our fire plants. It doesn't say fire. it says rescue.
Yeah.
I think working with the partners over the last 20 years has got a lot closer, I think, in terms of like seeing who's vulnerable. I think that's becoming far more nuanced now about who are the vulnerable in communities. And David touched on COVID. I think we began to see a little bit more of that about, kind of pinpointing that a little bit more. I think it's about sometimes about the long-term investment in some of the kit and equipment. And we've learned lessons. We're certainly not, where I'd like us to be, but we have to be proportionate about what we spend our money on. So, whether it be boats and PPE for firefighters, we've got flood first responder equipment, so dry suits and kit on every appliance. But it's not personal issue to every firefighter unless you're in the technical rescue team, which it is personal issue. So there's that investment in kit and equipment, and of course training and exercising with partners in those areas of risk. That is something that I'm super proud of. I've seen more and more exercises being done in the county in recent years. We did one in the Attenborough Lakes, which is an old gravel pits in part of Nottinghamshire. So doing more of that, but doing that with more multi-agency. And I think technology really is starting to play a better part. So we share drones with our police colleagues and starting to use that capability to build up an intelligent picture. So using that intelligence to inform. So things like where the EA might be sort of saying the riddle levels are this big and there won't be any flooding in that area. We used to send an officer in a car, and we still kind of do.
Oh, I lost you, Craig. Okay. David, shall we turn to your work? Hopefully Craig will come back to us. Oh, there you are. Are you coming back?
I had dropped out, sorry. Yeah,
sorry.
My apologies, Catherine.
You were talking about how things had changed. You send officers out in cars.
Yeah, so things like drones, so accessing drones, and drones are used for many, many things now. So I think we'll see more investments, certainly from my service, in coming years as we can try and make sure that capital investment, if we can go that way, we'll start to do more things like that. And I think making sure that your staff are confident in their skills and capabilities, and of course, what I would sort of say, their limitations. So floods are not water rescue, and flood first responder is not rescue, and making sure that your firefighters understand the limitations and the reasons for that as well. Because there are competency frameworks through DEFRA, concept of operations and things. So making sure that you're clear about that, but also making sure you bring those assets in quick on a shift basis, maybe rotating through the whole of. It's quite difficult on your kit and equipment placement and recovery of it.
Okay, so what we've got, it sounds to me like a big preparation exercise in terms of thinking about how you exercise the scenarios, how you make sure you've got the equipment, that your staff are all trained. You're using drones using drones in the preparation phase or part of exercising. Actually, once the sort of storm warnings are coming, do you send them out? How do they work? Because presumably they don't work very well in the rain. So
where there's an opportunity to use drones in exercises generally, flooding sense, but where reconnaissance, we would be considering use of drones in terms of reconnaissance, because of course what you don't want to do is send people out in cars and then floods coming in behind them. And I think what you've seen that with residents is that they don't understand the capability of their vehicles and get into distress in floodwater. And the last thing you want, of course, is for that to happen to your own vehicles.
Yes, absolutely. So, David, all of this that Craig's telling us about in terms of this preparation, the use of drones and so forth, are you seeing that in areas that you're involved with in your work currently?
Yeah, living in the county at Nottinghamshire, so I could confirm Craig and the teams did a great job, Catherine. But of course, it was one of 4 major named storms throughout a very short period of time. And I guess it was interesting to look at the cumulative effect of all of that going on over a long period of time. Especially on people like the Environment Agency you've mentioned already, their day job had to stop for significant periods in order for the whole organisation to concentrate on responding to ongoing events. I do think it really illustrates, though, Craig, I really support you, the value and the importance of national to local coordination of all those special assets. We have got much better. Our flood rescue teams have increased significantly in the last 5 years, partly as a result of some of the work we did in the East Coast Flood Group, which we're quite proud. But the ability to move assets around safely and in time, I think we're getting much, much better at doing that. And of course, protecting assets that are at flood risk in the first place, I think has been one of the valuable lessons from all of those storms. But again, the ability of the communities to respond to the naming conventions has been a fascinating one. The fact that the Met Office names these storms almost gives it a status above the normal weather report, which allows them to start thinking, if it's got a name, it must be something slightly more serious than the normal. So, there's a really good start of a conversation with what people might be able to do for themselves before the rain and the storm hits.
Yeah. I noticed somebody's just said something here about drones. It says, Catherine, police, fire, mountain rescue and lone rescue have drones that can fly in the rain. The main limit is the wind speed. So I'm just being corrected there. I probably should have known that. Okay, so can I just talk a little bit about vulnerable people? I think, Craig, you talked about this. So in terms of the people that you actually, because ultimately you're in population, you've got all the water and some areas being affected more than others depending on the geography. But some people are more vulnerable than others. So it's about people rather than place. How do you find them? How do you know where they are, given all of that preparation, to know that you can put your resource in the best place to have the best outcomes? Craig, how do you do that?
Well, I suppose, again, what intelligence have you got across your multi-agency partners? So local authorities, what information do they have? Health, how much information do they have about somebody who's vulnerable? Certainly, some of the floods, we've got some businesses affected, but we've got some people that not necessarily house bound, but house, restricted through flooding because they may well have mobility issues. We've even got crews going to do a bit of shopping for those individuals, because some people don't want to leave their homes, for whatever reason, they don't want to leave their homes. So, you've got crews doing a bit of shopping because they just need some food or they need somebody, picking up medication. And again, go back to COVID, I've got crews doing prescription delivery for people. Super proud of it. Whether they should or they shouldn't have been doing it, people in need needed somebody, and we were that somebody at the time. So I think a lot of people don't know they're vulnerable as well, Catherine, if I'm being really honest. Maybe because they don't like to admit they're vulnerable or whatever it is, or they'll think they'll be fine. That stoic nature maybe sometimes. But I think, again, what I would rely on a lot as well is the local knowledge of crews. They know where it floods in their so if it's surface water, they know which streets are going to flood.
Yeah.
We do a lot of things like safe and well visits now. So we do about 15 to 16,000 safe and well visits to domestic properties each year. So we've got a lot of information. I think where we've got some extra improvements is that how useful is that to draw that data through whether it postcode later. So the disciplines. So, fire is generally, communities are changing, but I think that is really useful. But again, local authorities, in terms of the amount of information that they have on residents, again, could be drawn on.
Yeah. Do you see that, David, in terms of the way that partners are working together in this modern way, that they are more thinking about people and place and understanding that, everybody has a different view on people, but they don't all come together. So how do we sort of deal with that? It's sort of a flooding issue, that's a general issue. I think about societal resilience, about how do you make sure you identify those who need the most help, and if they don't know they need help as well, the point Craig makes. Do you have an experience from other areas?
Yeah, I completely support what Craig just said, but I think increasingly it would be very useful, certainly within the multi-agency response forum, the mechanics of responding, to have a little bit more advocacy for some of those vulnerable people voices in the room, rather than the kind of traditional command and control approaches that we've relied on very successfully in the past. The one point I would make in addition, because I absolutely agree with everything Craig said, lots of data is held by different agencies, but we're talking about a systems approach here to bring all of that together effectively in a dynamic and real-time intelligence way. I don't want to comment on that because that's not particularly my expertise. What we do know, though, and again, support Craig around COVID, communities know the answer. It may be that we don't hold all the data anymore because of changes of public service delivery, but communities know who are vulnerable. And again, people during COVID immediately helped neighbours. Generally, in this country and elsewhere, we tend to sort ourselves out, our family, make sure our own homes are safe. Then we go and check on neighbours. Then we go and talk to people in the street that we know. And then we come together as a community to start thinking, what do we need to do for ourselves using what we've got available for us? So I think, again, that's why I keep on coming back to that conversation with building community resilience. I do think the biggest heart drop for me post flooding events is when you hear of an elderly person who's been found, who's drowned during that event because they've been missed out because nobody went and knocked on the door, or everybody else thought somebody else was doing it. It's trying to avoid that kind of event happening in the future. I think should be forefront of all of our thinking as we go forward.
In terms of that community information, so Craig talked about firefighters knowing their communities because they've done safe and well visits, they do with it, stuff in the environments in which they live, often particularly on-call firefighters will know a lot more about their communities. I wonder if we could look at the bodies which are made of volunteers. So one of our questions is around the mountain rescue teams, the Lone Rescue, Water Safe, UKSR. These are all organisations led by volunteers who come from those communities. How does that work when you bring those into the response, Craig, but also part of the preparation? How do you, because they're volunteers bringing all their local knowledge, but they're also their expertise in being able to rescue and deal with flooding. How does that work? Can you just explore that a little bit for us, Craig?
Well, you need to all be on the same page about what you're trying to achieve. Is a start. I think everybody who brings skills, capability, and competence to help communities is valued, but it's making sure that everybody understands that has to be done in a very coordinated way. Because what you don't want, of course, is whether that's fire, police, voluntary sector, to become casualties themselves, or people don't know where they are, and then having to commit, limited resources to save the rescuers almost. Well, look, there's a national asset register for people to register, and there's a criteria people need to meet to be on that register. So whether it be type A, type B teams, whether they're just flood rescue, so whether they've got powered boats or non-powered boats. I can't speak in terms of the quality assurance. It's outside of my kind of knowledge and understanding the role I do now. But what you need confidence that when people are deployed, so when you've asked for national assistance, for example, you know who you're getting in the county. Because I don't want to commit limited resources either to coordinating people who can't do the job they've come to do, or actually become a liability in themselves. And that's why I sort of said earlier about my own service, firefighters understanding their own limitations. You've got that ability to make sure that you get these resources on board. And of course, some of the capabilities, it can be very niche and not what fire and rescue service have got. So they do definitely add to, David's view is it's a multi-agency, multi-partner approach, and it's not the time to get precious. But you do need to know, you need to come with your credibility as an organisation.
Of course, yes. And I think that the questioner here is talking about DEFRA compliant flood response teams. So I think the competence and the experience is kind of writ large in that term. I don't know it, but presumably there's some accreditation. They can give you the reassurance that you're looking for, that they are, become assets that help you on the ground. So let's talk about the other agencies. So we've mentioned the Environment Agency, there's the Met Office, there's all these other agencies who help to respond. How does that work, David, in terms of the response, recovery? We haven't really talked about recovery particularly, but where do they kind of fit into all of this?
Well, the Met Office and Environment Agency for flood events clearly are really quite central, quite critical, because they are the people who hold the subject matter expertise, but also the data, the intelligence to allow you to make a threat assessment. So people like Craig, colleagues, can make decisions about, how to respond, what proportionality, etc. So I think they're critical. I have to say, in personal experience over the last 15 years, I think forecasting to repeat has become much more improved, very, very coherent, very well coordinated. But you always have to remember with severe weather events that they, by nature, are unpredictable. false alarms are always going to be inevitable. It's weather. You can't always get it absolutely right. So the days of Michael Fish, bless him, and the famous storm,
My God, that must have been the 80s, a long time ago.
Absolutely, yeah. But I think we live with that far better. And I do think that then gives people like Craig, colleagues like Craig, far more confidence in their ability to raise your, or draw your attention, sorry, to a potential threatening event. It's then about how well people work together as partners, isn't it? And I absolutely agree. I think we do command and control, coordination, communication exceedingly well. But I personally think it's all about agility and flexibility of thinking that makes the difference, because no event ever happens the way that you planned for it. There's always a nuance. There's always something different. And I think we'd be better off now spending a little bit more time, in addition to all of the really invaluable JESIP stuff, talking about how do you create the ability of partners to create, familiarity, relationship, and confidence in each other, to be far more agile in the way they think about solutions in a slightly more dynamic way. I'm not saying that we're not good at that. I think we clearly are, but I think that should be a focus going forward because of the unpredictability of these increasingly, severe, frequent weather events that are going to continue to challenge us.
So I read somewhere about Storm Henk, and in terms of the impact on the River Trent, so it was the highest level it had been in 20 years. So did you train and exercise for that, Craig? Do you kind of look in those sorts of scenarios where this is the risk, it could look like this? Is that how it works?
Well, you try and train as close to reality as you can, where you can, but without being unnecessarily, putting your staff at a place where, what benefits have they got for training in that environment? So you kind of try and do that. It's not something unusual. If I think about the last quarter of a century, if you look through Nottingham City, which used to flood a lot more, it's had a lot of, particularly along the Trent, had a lot of flood mitigation done. So if you look at where the current council house is, the Nottingham Forest ground, down towards that side, it's had a lot of investment. But you can't carry on doing that the whole length of a river, can you? It's just, just economically just would not make sense to. So you try and get as close to reality as you can in terms of the water conditions. We'll be looking to train on the Trent again, subject to water quality and everything else, because you do have to sort of bear in mind is that you've got to train, but you've got to look after your people, and that includes when you're preparing to respond as well as when you respond. So yeah, it's kind of difficult. I think the predictions, certainly David's point, the predictions certainly help. I think you have to have the ability to interpret the data, and I think that's possibly been a challenge for the Fire and Rescue Service for a number of years. I think we're getting there now, and I think as well is that what does it look like on the ground? The Met Office and the AA maybe sort of saying, oh, it's only at level 6.4 at the gauge. But actually, if you walk down the street, you struggle to get a car or a vehicle up and down the street. But one agency may say it shouldn't be flooded there. But you may have firefighters on the ground saying, well, I'm up to my ankles in water here. So it's about sharing that intelligence really, really quickly. And I think being careful about what you're distracted with as well, because social media can be really, really useful, but it can be really debilitating. And if you're not careful about how you pander to it or you don't.
Yes, I saw a picture with Storm Henk of a big sign in the road, clearly full of water, and a car going along it. It was kind of trying to make the point that people just completely ignore the signs and just carry on, because I think, well, I know what it's like, I can do this. So maybe that's some of that. And also it's about the agility that you talked about, David, in terms of being able to respond to what you see on the ground as well as what you think about elsewhere. Somebody's asked one of the questions about the role of police. We haven't really talked about police, and I know, David, you were a police officer for a very long time. So what's the role of policing when it comes to a flood like this? In Henk, what were they doing? Where did they sit in this environment?
Well, I'm sure Craig will answer directly around Henk, but generically their role is obviously to be a part of a multi-agency response. Their primary focus is always going to be on saving life, as is Fire and Rescue Service indeed, and then minimising any additional harm. They're working right the way through a hierarchy, I guess, of objectives, right the way down to helping people recover. In a flood event, they tend to be incredibly helpful on the ground around cordon, stopping people entering to the danger areas, for example, supporting some of the command and control coordination, both at a local operational level, tactical, and then, of course, within the strategic. Historically, they tend to chair multi-agency partnership meetings. And I think that reflects the command and control skill sets that fire colleagues, police colleagues in particular, bring to the table. Not uniquely, though, because in my experience, I think local authority officers also have or are developing really good skill sets. But Craig will probably answer more directly. But in generic terms, Catherine, they don't have a lead responder responsibility for the flood as the technical event. What they're doing is trying to help out in the kind of consequence management of the larger, broader issues that come out of the flooding itself.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Great. Does that reflect your experience of this storm?
Yeah, I think in the response element, blue lights bring that command and control. So you would hope that we bring order to the chaos that's in front of you. You'd hope. And that isn't a skill that's not in other agencies, but it's not as commonly practiced. Because, of course, police and fire are still responding to other things each day and putting command and control in place. So the building blocks are there probably more naturally to fire. Are there. They've already agreed what the strategic priorities are for the LRF, save lives, prevent damage and return to normal as quickly as possible. Because as soon as you start responding, you're beginning to think about the recovery stage, because it will happen at some point. So everybody's got those strategic goals in mind to get the community back to a place of normality, whether it's the same one previously or a new norm for them or not. Yeah. So, police, they still have a job to do. And of course, crime doesn't stop. I think it said in one of the comments, crime doesn't stop. And maybe some parts of society see an opportunity where there is a bit of a disaster taking place that the police have to be alive to, I would imagine.
Yeah, that's interesting about the crime side. And you're right, other things still carry on, life still carries on. One of our questions here is around pets, saying that, if people are being impacted by flooding, they've got their pets. They want their life to remain the same because they want their pets with them and they don't want them to be in danger. It's asking here, but what's your planning assumption for the challenges of safe removal of people with pets? How does that work? I'm going to ask Craig this. I'm going to assume that he knows the answer to this.
Well,
do they just jump on the boat? What happens?
Look, you always try and deal with the kind of the wishes of the individual. That if you're talking about somebody in rescue here, some people, their pet is their soulmate, their companion, and their life basically. And I would hope and expect that certainly my staff, their previous wife or partner for 60 years want to bring out a picture of a partner because it's the most valuable possession, and that goes with pets. I'm a pet owner myself. It's I'm fifth in line in the family. It's my sons and my pets before me.
Yeah.
So I think there's a difference between pet and, of course, you've got businesses that are animal-based businesses. We've got a lot of stables and horse owners down the Trent Valley, where it's kind of big business as well. So for different animals from a different angle present different challenges. But if it's doable at the scene, crews will do their best. Cat or dog is a bit more easy than say
a horse in the boat. It's going to be tricky. I can see that. I need to move us on to our next. We were just going to talk briefly about the flood recovery framework and about the sort of finances that bring the recovery of businesses and people's lives, this normal that Craig, you talked about, or their new normal, and to stop businesses going under. Because obviously when we talk about fire, sometimes they'll put people out of business, and I'm sure flooding probably has a similar impact. The financial arrangements that are in place, David, I wonder if you could just sketch out briefly for us what that might look like for somebody and what impact that can have and whether that helps in the long term for them to get back to normal.
Yeah, of course, a lot will depend, I guess, Catherine, on insurance cover for the flood risk that businesses in particular knowingly live with. There are granting schemes that kick in a civil emergency once an emergency has been declared by a local resilience forum. They include the Bellwin scheme to compensate local authorities in the main, unless that's changed, Craig. And again, forgive me, Catherine, I'm a few years out. having now worked at the university, not within NRF, but clearly that would kick in to support some of the funding that might be spent locally to recover. And then there'll be business grants. Like if you think about COVID and the way that kicked in to support, the maintenance, the continuity of some essential services, for example. The government have, I think, generally proved to be really good, actually, in Cumbria, other areas where there've been prolonged, widespread flooding, to try to support the local economy as far as possible. But again, it goes back to the whole question of living with flood risk and having continuity plans in place and thinking about how do you keep a business resilient to the kind of threats it's likely to face over a longer period of time. And I don't think the flood recovery framework is geared up to look a little bit further afield.
So it doesn't kind of close that loop. If we think about it as a cycle, the sort of planning for, the preparing, the responding, the recovering, and go back to planning. If it doesn't help you plan and prepare, then it'll just keep going around in circles, won't it? So you're saying that basically the money is like a very short-term fix, but actually it's not helping the longer-term problem.
It depends on how money's spent, Catherine. I don't want to get I don't want to get controversial. There's a lot of funding out there for innovation efforts, and it's absolutely most welcome. But it's whether we're spending money wisely, isn't it? It's whether it's just activity for activity's sake, or whether actually it's confusing activity with effectiveness in the way the money's been targeted and spent. But I, to repeat, I think it's more about, look, we need to learn to live with this risk. If we all agree that it's going to become more severe and more frequent, then we need to make some sensible decisions about how communities and business live alongside a recognised flood risk longer term. And that could include a complete rethink about how you deliver some of those services locally.
Okay. That leads me nicely to what I was going to ask you about, because we have the election next week and we have a new government and we have an opportunity. We're going to put a crystal ball in front of us in this little webinar and think about what it is we'd like the government to do. Obviously, I realise, Craig, you can't be too political, and David, you might not want to either, but just broadly, the Public Accounts Committee report we talked about right at the beginning said that the Environment Agency and others were underfunded to deal with the risk. The fire service doesn't actually have a statutory responsibility to respond to flooding, although I take the point that Craig made earlier. And it says that whether emergency services should be influencing policy and funding for flooding to make it better. So if you were to have a kind of crystal ball and you wanted to say to the government what should be doing about flooding, what would you say? David, let's start with you.
Well, I mean, to be clear, so I currently work with the University of Manchester, Catherine, but I can only answer that question on a purely personal, private basis. I think that it doesn't really matter which government is in power, as long as the commitment to carry on with the societal resilience agenda is in place, then I think that's a win-win for everybody. I do think, more importantly, 18 months into that national resilience framework, it would be incredibly useful if we could now bring together all the key players to have a conversation about, well, where have we got to and where are we stuck in particular? And are we really talking to each other across things like CPNG, the emergency services, the voluntary sector, the community sector, LRFs, local authorities, the environment agency? Are we all really sharing our thoughts about what we think societal resilience is and where we can get the bigger bang for the bucks? Because there's no doubt that public value conversation is just going to continue. But I think the sooner we see it as a much broader agenda, a cross-systems approach to making life better for everybody, then I think we'll probably get stuck in carry on doing short-term activities rather than getting to a much more productive outcome or end game. So I don't think it matters what government's in place as long as the commitment to pursuing this agenda remains in place. I think that's more important.
Okay. All right. So Craig, is that what your crystal ball looks like? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, look, I think if you go back, go back kind of 30, I could probably go back to the armed forces, where some of our role sometimes was to assist the local communities in terms of like flood and those kind of things. But I think what David's talking about there again is that kind of systems-wide approach and it being consistent across all levels and all agencies about what it is we're trying to deal with in terms of flooding. There is the bit about getting communities to a place that living with this threat and this risk is part of life, and do people in their homes and businesses. So, the ability to promote business continuity through the LRF the funding isn't about repairing it to how it was. The bit for me is about building in resilience, that it has less impact next time. Whether you want to claim it's climate change or it was just a storm, whatever the reason, it's about building in intrinsically more resilience to it in the future, and bringing that together. I mean, there's been lots of lessons written and reports written around taking a systems thinking approach. I think Emergency Planning College did one after Storm thinking. I think in being a lot more, David's point, a lot more joined up over the longer term has got to be the strategic way to go, as opposed to multiple agencies doing something slightly different. It's got to be a far more joined up and longer term vision.
Okay, all right, that's very clear. Thank you both for bearing with me with my crystal ball thing going on there. So it leads me nicely. I'm afraid we're going to have to draw to a close in the next couple of minutes. So it's been fantastic to cover off so many different things. Apologies for some of the connectivity problems we've been having. Craig dropping in and out, and I know there's been some issues with some people coming in, but hopefully it will all resolve itself with catch up. So it leads me to my final question to you, which is a very simple one with a very kind of swift response, which is, what is the one piece of advice that you would give our listeners or people watching us to let them go back to their organisations and talk about what they should be thinking about when it comes to flooding and resilience? So what is the one takeaway, David? What do you want them to talk about?
Am I allowed to have one that's got 3 sub-points? I'll make it very quick though, Catherine.
All right, as long as they're quick.
I think have an honest conversation with communities and business about living with the flood risk that's obvious. Everybody can see where it is.
Yeah.
The second one is trust communities, the voluntary sector and businesses to help themselves. Almost be confident to almost get out of their way and support them to be more resilient by using what's available to them, on a day-to-day basis, and truly believe everybody does have a role to play in making society more resilient. Just think about how you can engage with wider parts of the world to engage in that conversation.
Fantastic. Your societal resilience thing runs all the way through you. Thank you very much. Craig, what's yours?
Well, I ditto all the thing about community that David said. So there's an external, like the community side, on the advice around if people are responders on the event today, is make sure you've got a good partnership, network and relationship. Make sure you know who you're talking to. Make sure that not only your own agency is competent to be there around the table, but can speak for the organisation that they're there to represent, but making sure from the outset that everybody around the table can make decisions, because if they can't, what are they doing around the table? And they're not doing communities any favours. They're actually delaying response to communities. So make sure you know who you're talking to around the table before you need them. That preparedness side, Catherine. Make sure you know who it is and you're training and exercising with them before the storm comes.
Perfect. And have their telephone numbers. This is what you told us earlier as well. So fantastic. In that case, it just leads me to thank you very much to both of you for joining us today to talk about resilience to flooding. I think we've covered a wide range of things, and it's a very strong sense of where the community fits in with this, the role they have to play, and the role that this sort of interaction between the services and the community, and to get that whole of society approach that we talked about right at the beginning. So I think that's wrapped it up nicely. So thank you very much. It leaves me just to wrap up the main points from today. So thank you. This webinar will be available to watch on catch up via our website. Any notes for the webinar will be hosted there too. I can put in the references to the documents I've mentioned. You'll receive CPD accreditation by email, and if you're watching on catch up, you'll get this as well, but at the end of the month. Do join us for the next webinar in our Preparing For series, where we'll be talking about preparing for safer emergency fleets on July 11th, so next Thursday, 2 weeks' time, because next week's the election, with our partner Hard Alert, and you can sign up for that now. And do visit our website, emergencyservicestimes.com. I think I know that. And also know that we now do a daily digest. So if you want to hear more from us and find out what's going on across the sector, then do sign up to get that into your inbox. In which case, it just leaves me to say thank you very much for watching.